Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
So my name is Dr. Samantha Rowland and I'm a lecturer in exercise physiology and nutrition at Loughborough University. And today I'm joined by Olivia Murphy, Performance Director at Loughborough University, and Dr. Kelsey Johnson, Senior Lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University and founder of NXP Coaching. Hi Olivia and Kelsey, thank you for joining us on the Experts in Sport podcast today. In this episode, we're going to dive into some discussion around data-driven innovation in women's sport. We will unpick how research, partnership and ethical data use can create safer, more equitable environments for female athletes. But before we get going, Liv and Kelsey, could you just let the audience know a little bit more information about yourselves and your background, please?
My name's Olivia Murphy, as you've already said. My background is mainly in playing netball. So I was lucky enough to be an international netballer and captain, played about 100 times, just less than for England, and captained my country for 6 years. Following that, I tried my hand out in accountancy, didn't quite make it in that world, and then moved into sports performance here at Loughborough University, worked within different sporting programmes. Worked in sports science, sports medicine, and now find myself as a performance director here at Loughborough University. My role encompasses looking after our top-end performance athletes, of which we've got about 800, and I'm lucky enough to work with the coaches and the sports science and medicine that support those athletes in their journeys here.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Kelsey Johnson. As Sam's already said, I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. I like to call myself, or I think Verity may have said this, as the entrepreneurial academic. So alongside the research and teaching I do at LJMU, I also own a business called Nutrition and Performance Coaching, where I provide nutrition and performance coaching support predominantly to female athletes, particularly hybrid athletes that like to run faster and get stronger, for example. And I teach and research predominantly in nutrition and physiology, with a lot of the focus of my research being female athletes themselves. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you both very much for providing those kind of background perspectives. You can see that today we have some real depth and breadth in terms of our knowledge here across female athletes across a spectrum of sports. So to get us going then, Liv, from your perspective working in kind of applied sport with elite athletes, what does data-driven innovation in sport mean to you, and how does it connect to athlete well-being?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think the thing with applied sport, and obviously we see it across multiple programs, is there are what we would call challenges or performance problems all the time. So every day, every sport, male, female, it kind of doesn't matter. There are loads of different challenges and problems that we face. So data-driven innovation to me means, how do we find a way to help find multiple solutions to those problems through data? And the beauty then of the practitioners and the coaches that we then work with, their task is to try and find the solution that they want to take forward and try and help solve the problem. Also, obviously, align the roles and the way forward with those people, but ultimately choosing a solution, hopefully data informed, so it gives us a bit of an evidence base to choose from, and then help the athletes with their solution to get better. And I guess how it links, therefore, to well-being. First and foremost, there's no point in having data if we can't translate it into the applied world. That's hugely important. But equally, we have to think about the athlete in every conversation we have. So not only just the information and do they understand it, but also how they can actually apply it to their everyday world. And also how it endeavours to help them at their sport right now, but equally their long-term future. So there's no point in having something that is going to help them be the best athlete in the world, but cripple them in 10 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes 100% sense, Olivia. And I guess from your perspective, have you got any examples you could share of where you have those multiple cards on the table for different options and the solution that you chose for a particular athlete or team?
So I think the simplest one to talk about, I think, just to kick us off with, is we use monitoring wellbeing apps and lots of different ones across our sports here, 21 sports we have. So multiple different athlete wellbeing systems and apps that we work with. And if we use Netball as an example, we use PDMS in that. And the big thing we try to look at is loading. And one of the challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit later on, is we end up trying to get to the solution of what's the optimal load without really knowing what the problem is. So we're still working through that at the moment. But, and again, we'll probably talk about it a bit later, but ACL injuries are hugely prominent in netball and other female sports. But the nature of our game means we are going to have to stop, start, and change direction a lot of the time. So how do we look at our monitoring system alongside our GPS data, our accels and decels, and our change directions that we have to have alongside, therefore, what our athletes need to do every day? So in the simplest form, we have a lot of information that needs to guide our way through to then deliver to the athlete on a daily basis as to what they need to do, ultimately to help them be the best in the world, which is what they're aspiring to do, but in the safest way possible. So we try and avoid our injuries along the way.
That's brilliant insight for us there. And Kels, would you mind sharing your experience of working directly with athletes in data-informed environments?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not sure if I can follow up with as good as an answer from Liv there, but I think she really nicely summarised how well you can use data. And I think from my side, a slightly different angle is I'm not working with elite athletes. I'm working with recreational athletes that just want to be like the best they can be. And I think with those type of athletes, sometimes the priority needs to be more around things like recovery. Not saying that's not important for elite athletes, but these people are working full-time jobs and then adding the additional stress of training load onto their stressful jobs, their family life, and all these other things. So when working with the more recreational side as opposed to performance side, the data can be really helpful and insightful in terms of, are we recovering properly? Because if we're not recovering properly and we've got high levels of stress, then we're not going to adapt to the training that we're giving you anyway. So like it's a big aspect of like what I do is like load management around their actual life as well as the training itself, which is usually very important to them because they're obviously invested in having somebody support them. And it's kind of trying to maximize that. But a lot of the data predominantly that I guess I use is the performance driven metrics. So for runners, it's heart rate, it's pace. For anyone that likes to also incorporate cycling, it's like power on the bike, for example. So for me, it's there are data informed decisions, but it's almost like data performed human centric decisions all combined into one to kind of create and spot patterns and see where things might be going wrong or where things are actually going well as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks, Kels. And it gives us a really nice perspective then on kind of the two ends of that prong. So you've got your recreational athletes right through to your performance athletes. And some of those demands will, of course, overlap in different ways and some of them will be different. But I think it really nicely highlights the use of data can be across all spans of kind of the participation framework.
I just think it's really interesting listening to Kelsey, because one of our challenges is we do get a lot of data from the sporting bit that the athletes do. So, we can measure how much they run. We can have a GPS unit that tells them all of this information, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the information about the other 16 hours of the day that they're not doing their sport. So, we have a performance lifestyle team here that need to think about the whole athlete, and we have student athletes as well, of course. So when we think about player load or athlete load that we talk about, we have to be broader than just what they do on the pitch or the track or the pool. And I was really interested, I guess, from Kelsey's perspective, how we continue in the future to align all of this, that it isn't just what we think about of the athlete and the load there, but equally the load as a human being. And then secondly to that was just we're getting more and more athletes now who are female athletes who are coming back post pregnancy. And that's also shifting how we're thinking about this human being alongside the sporting superstar. So when we think about a mum's loan, that's very different now to an athlete that's just got themselves to think about.
I think that's what part of looking at female athletes is so interesting, because we have all of these life phases to consider, whether that's puberty, whether it's the menstrual cycle, contraception, pregnancy, postpartum, and then ultimately the menopause. That gives us a real span of athletes to work with, both recreational through to elite level and masters level, where we can use data, as you say, not just about their training, but more broadly about their kind of lifestyle and that broader impact of stress and strain on their life to inform what we're doing. So yeah, really, really good opening discussion there. Thank you both very much. So yeah, Liv, in your role, you'll have quite a strategic view on innovation and athlete support. So how do we ensure that athlete voices are central in design and implementation of our data systems?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? And as I mentioned before, there's no point in having a million different data solutions and thoughts if we haven't actually thought about the athlete in the middle of it. And a really silly anecdote to this, we played in our Super League semis and finals last year with Lightning Netball, and the broadcaster wanted to have our captains mic'd up in the warm-up so the viewers would get a really good interactive experience with that individual. But what they hadn't taken into account was the microphone and the battery pack was far too heavy to sit on a netball dress. And so what they asked her to do was tuck it into her shorts as she was warming up. Now, when you look at that in reality, that's absolutely ridiculous, because this athlete is trying to compete at the highest level in her sport that she can domestically. And all she was worried about, whether this earpiece would stay in and whether a battery pack would sit in her shorts under a dress. And when I reflected on that, I was just thinking about, at no point did they link into the athlete. At no point did they talk to them. They thought about the viewer and their experience, and they thought about the product that they were putting out there, and they were thinking about the event experience, but they hadn't put the athlete in the middle of it. So I guess from my perspective, there's an obvious conversation with an athlete in there, like, what are the challenges you're facing on a day-to-day basis or in a long-term perspective? And we do that really simply through athlete one-to-ones. We do it in case conference styles with our athletes. So bringing an athlete in, getting all our practitioners and coaches to sit in and around them to hear from them first and foremost. We also do it through surveys and various other methods. But ultimately, it's about trying to get a very strong-willed athlete to share with us their wants and needs, and then mold it into something that's practical for them to move forward. But like I say, just with that silly anecdote, it just shows, I think, if you don't speak to the athlete at the start of this journey, it's really difficult to understand where they might want to get to.
And I think that's a really important consideration when we think about maybe male sports versus female sports. I know in cricket, the captain typically does have a earpiece on, and they're talking like throughout the game, which is great for watching. And I guess that's probably where they've got the inspiration from. But they have pockets, they have jackets, they're wearing trousers, and it's almost like those differences in even the kit that we wear can have such an impact on other factors. Because I know for a fact I wouldn't want to shove a battery pack down my dress, because then I know there's going to be like a lump there, for example. And then you're thinking,
Correct.
Are people thinking about this lump down the side of my dress, for example?
Yeah, and we're thinking about it from a performance angle. We're trying to find the 1%ers typical language that's going to help them perform better in these big games. And she has 25 minutes to warm up physically, psychologically on the court in those moments. The last thing she needs to do is come over to a coach and say, sort this out. Yeah. So, we're working with Cookery as a dress provider, looking at how the shape of the dress, the wear of the dress, how it handles sweat. We're thinking about all of these things. We're certainly not, and maybe we need to in the future think about how we get a microphone attached to it. Maybe that's the future.
Yeah, definitely a really nice anecdote to have shared with us there, Liv. And I guess it just made me think about how things are changing in sport for women. So when we think about kit, for example, I'm thinking about Wimbledon and tennis and how now the athletes don't have to wear white shorts, for example. So we are
Yeah.
starting to move, hopefully in the right direction there, where we do listen to athletes. But there are clearly still examples of when we've not put the athlete first, and obviously we need to move in that direction much more as we move forward.
And there are other really good examples, we're pockets for GPS units, making sure that rugby is a kind of leading the light in some of those spaces, making sure that that's thought about in kit design and dress, and we're thinking about it from a dress design perspective. So there are some really brilliant examples. Another really good one is we've been looking at scrum machine design. So looking at male and females and how they play rugby in different ways and the heights that they get into in the scrum. So we've been working with partners just around leading the way in that space. So we are thinking about the female athlete in all aspects of their performance.
So I guess linked to that then, so in a perfect world, what does a truly athlete-centered, data-informed support system look like?
Oh, that's a nice, easy question. Thanks for that. I mean, we'll never get there because it's never a perfect world, right? We're always trying to innovate and get better. So this balance between data and human is really important to me. We had a brilliant performance analyst that worked with us that had the best amount of data, but there was no point if we couldn't translate that into something that the athletes could pick up and run with. So that perfect balance, enough metrics so that people can understand which way that we need to go. But equally having to review, reflect, adjust daily so that you get that human impact. So, when we're working in camps or in an environment like Loughborough, you do see your athletes every day. So we can have that kind of ongoing dialogue alongside the data to see what changes we need to make to their everyday training as well as their everyday lives. And that could be through a wellbeing app. It could be, you talked, Sam, before about menstrual cycle and keeping an eye on that. And how that then informs what we can and can't and how we do and don't push athletes at certain times. I think those things are starting to get to where we want to be in this kind of data-driven world. And then slightly differently, I think we also look into talent ID and talent recruitment. So I think data can also help us in that environment where we're looking at future world-class athletes and how we look at data to help us in that space. But that's a conversation maybe for another day.
Liv, I've got a question for you.
Oh.
No. It's more a feedback on the academic world, to be honest. Thinking about everything you're saying, that you're using almost the data to inform future practice and whatever that might be. And I think it's probably been accepted a lot now in the research that maybe there has been this disconnect between like what the scientists are doing and what like practitioners need.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious as to like how you maybe try and use data, if you do, from science, and for you, what's like the biggest like barrier, or like what can we do as academics to make sure that our data that we find in the field is actually usable for you?
Yeah, amazing. So my head went in a couple of places. First and foremost, it's agreeing on what the questions are and what the problems are, because I think traditionally, and certainly we're in a different place now, but an academic might be interested in something that just isn't real for us. And kind of what's the point in that? Because we're never going to then think about how we connect and apply that. So I think what we're doing a brilliant job of, or trying to head in that direction, is starting really early in this journey about what's the actual challenge we're trying to tackle here, and then aligning the performance question or academic question that you're looking into, research question. And then also the second part is our world's moved so fast. So innovation today is different to innovation tomorrow. So how do we, in the academic and research space, keep up with that change? So our problems change all the time. So I think that's point two. And then the third one for me is around we have a brilliant lady, Becky Grant, who works on breast health. And you two obviously know Becky, but she has really made the information that she's gathering relevant to our athletes directly. And so, again, we use the Lightning Netball example, but we had a couple of athletes who were really struggling with bra fit and how that was impacting their performance. So Becky and team came and spoke to the athletes in ways that they really understood. So didn't baffle them with a load of science, literally translated it into how this was going to help them every day. And funnily enough, a couple of athletes took her up on the offer, and now they're all really interested in this space and how it can help them be better netballers. And so it really is about whether the academic can translate it into words these athletes understand, or whether they need to take someone else, a coach, a practitioner, on the journey with them. I don't mind, but it's getting them over to the athletes about how they will be better based on the information provided. And I think that's a really good example of where Becky did that brilliantly, and the athletes talk about it in a really positive light.
Well, thanks, Liv. And yeah, just highlighting the importance there of kind of co-creating research questions between practitioners, athletes, and the academics, not doing that independently. And then the importance of that translation of information so that it doesn't get lost in translation, right? So we have that lay communication between those academics and those people that you're directly trying to help ultimately, because there's no point doing this brilliant research if actually the people that you're trying to help never have the access to it. So yeah, I think that's a really good point you make there. And I guess you've just highlighted there, my next question was going to be around how do we at Loughborough specifically kind of foster partnerships and enable these sorts of kind of retest approaches? And I guess you just gave us a really nice example of how working with Becky Grant and looking at sports bras is a way that we've tried to integrate that. But do you have any kind of other anecdotes or experiences to add to that?
Yeah, and one thing I probably didn't say about Becky is what we also tried to do is we tried to explain to her our lens as well. And I think I'm not sure all sports coaches and practitioners are able necessarily to explain what their problems and performance problems are. So I'm certainly not sitting here saying, academics aren't doing a good job translating this. What I'm saying is it's a two-way conversation and really trying to get to the under the surface of what these challenges are. So definitely a two-way thing there. I think one of the examples for us is just how we work with a couple of our partners, Huddle and Catapult. I think they're two brilliant examples of where we're trying to test what's happening on the ground and then learn from it, iterate and go again. So if we use Huddle as a brilliant example, I think we have an MSc within our performance analysis course where we've got the practitioners of the future coming through and helping work with our performance athletes on the applied side. So they get a great opportunity with Huddle to look at data. It then informs our performance plans, which we work within our performance programs. So effectively our what it takes to win metrics, how we win games. And then again, Huddle will come through and look at how they can create new code windows. They look at how they can translate that information directly to athletes and coaches. And they can be at the kind of the coalface with Premier League clubs or rugby clubs, where they're looking at the cutting edge technology and then can feed it back through into our students and our practitioners. So one example there, just where I feel like we're using our students, we're using our high level athletes, but we're also using a partner to try and be at the front of what we're trying to do.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Liv.
Sam, question for you. I know a lot of the work you and I both do is focused on ovarian hormones and the influence that can potentially have on health and performance. So how can athlete data better understand some of these hormonal fluctuations that you've already mentioned? We have things like menopause, where we've got fluctuations, hormonal contraceptives, where they might not have that natural kind of hormonal profile that we see of a naturally menstruating female. How can we use that data?
This is a really big, great question, Kels, a very sciencey question as well. So I'll try and keep this zoomed out, but
yes, please, Sam, keep it zoomed out so I understand what I'm talking about.
I'll just start by saying there's been a lot of conversation, buzz around, particularly on social media and also in podcast environments, about things like the menstrual cycle and how it might influence everything from training, nutrition and periodization of nutrition, performance and injury risk as well. And while there's this big growing awareness and conversation around the topic of the menstrual cycle and injury performance and all these other things, a lot of this evidence, I say with iteration, is based upon anecdotal evidence from athletes. It's not been derived from studies with methodological rigor that we might do in a laboratory environment, for example. And that's where athlete data becomes so important. So in order to truly understand how hormonal fluctuations, so for example, those that occur across the menstrual cycle or those that might occur throughout pregnancy, to understand how they affect health and performance in athletes, we need to really collect data in a way that's rigorous and scientific. And what this means on the ground is recruiting athletes to take part in well-designed studies with controlled conditions and with sufficient numbers so that we can make meaningful conclusions. And of course, as I'm saying this, I realise that that's quite a big ask, right? That's trying to do a lot of things with athletes that are time poor and require particular constraints. But this is where we have the demanding schedules of athletes. They may have family responsibilities, concerns around invasive procedures, and we have to balance that with the need for kind of this rigorous data to be able to draw conclusions on these big topics. So I think what this needs to overcome is this high quality data is something we need, but we really need to understand what the athletes can get from that data and create an environment that means that they are not just giving to research, they receive something in return. And I think, drawing on your point earlier, Liv, around what kind of Becky's done really well is, yes, she's probably collected some data from the athletes that's been useful for her research, but she's given back by kind of communicating with the athletes about kind of sports bras and fits and things to look for in a way that means they get something from their data. So I think that's really important, and hopefully a pretty long-winded way of trying to answer your question or dance around your question, Kelsey, of how we might do that in practice.
No, I agree, and not all. And I think we also need to be careful as researchers if we are wanting to look at menstrual cycle for effect. Is there rationale for actually looking at that one analyte, whatever it might be, and menstrual cycle? Because there's been, like you say, Sam, this massive call for more high quality research in females, and it's great that we've got to a place now where we are considering female physiology and the female athlete, and not everything's done in men. It's amazing, but sometimes you do step back and think, are we like almost going too fast and answering like the wrong questions first? And are we just going, oh, let's take this and look at the effect of the menstrual cycle on that, even though we don't necessarily have that rationale for it just yet, or whatever that might be? So yeah, I definitely agree. We need more of that high quality stuff that unfortunately takes a bit longer and is a bit more time consuming to do, but will be worth it in the end, because we'll be able to have specific guidelines, whether those guidelines are it's no different from males.
Yeah, 100%, Kelsey. And I think you make a really good point that a lot of the time when we think about the female athlete, we often oversimplify that and boil it down to being about the menstrual cycle when actually a large proportion of women don't have a menstrual cycle, either because they're on contraception, because they've been through the menopause, or perhaps because they've lost their cycle for various reasons. So I think we have to be careful to not boil the female athlete down to being all about their menstrual cycle, when we know that there's loads of other factors that come into play that may be more important for a particular question. And that's where, again, your point comes in, Liv, of really answering the questions that you have on the ground in that performance environment. And it might not be, how does the menstrual cycle impact this aspect of carbohydrate metabolism? That might not be something you care about. It might be a question that's more around the pitch and ACL injuries and what's the surface interaction. It could be that the questions that we think we need answering are not the questions on the ground. And if we're going to get that athlete informed data that we need to answer questions that the athletes see the answers to.
On that as well, I think when you talk about needing enough athletes in the right environments to get the right data, one of the things that I often think about is we might be researching data and the athletes that are currently on the ground might not get the benefits of it. And I think that's a real challenge for all of us to work through, because let's be honest, these athletes are pretty selfish. Like, they want information for themselves to be better, and it's much harder to buy them into something that might give us information in 10 years time or 5 years time or whatever, when their careers might be over. So I am curious about how we do get to that point where we can support athletes now to help us inform athletes of the future.
And Sam, another question is, we talk about we need to potentially do more of these high quality studies. How do we kind of encourage or foster an environment where we get more females, women to take part in the research? Because that's a barrier in itself.
Yeah, and I think I'll link this back to what Liv just said. I think it's vitally important that we actually share the findings of whatever research that we're conducting with those athletes, because many women and men, when they get involved in research, do so because they're genuinely curious about their bodies and their response to whatever the research question might be. They might be really interested in understanding how hydration affects their performance, or how ingesting a particular supplement affects their performance. So they want to know about this. They want to know about their physiology and their response to see if actually it could be something they change in their training or their practice to help them. So I think it's really important that we do take the time to give feedback and results in a clear and an engaging way that means that they feel valued as a participant. And that often is a good way to encourage future involvement in research as well. So I think fundamentally we need to kind of not just wait for the publications to come out and assume that people see those as, oh, the findings are out in 3 or 4 years time, and actually that athlete has gone through a whole cycle of training, competition, wherever they might be, and they've not seen any benefit. So really important that we do that.
And then I guess following on from that is, how do you make sure that the data that you collect is used ethically and in a way that, you've kind of mentioned this now, but like empowers that athlete as well?
Yeah, so we're really careful to only collect information that's genuinely needed to answer a particular research question. So we try and avoid asking unnecessary questions, do unnecessary tests or invasive procedures that don't directly contribute to what we're trying to achieve, or they don't help the athlete. We try and be as transparent as possible with our data collection, so the athletes understand exactly how their data is going to be used, stored and shared. And this helps build trust and ensures that the participants always feel that everything's been co-collaborative in the approach. And things do become a bit more complex when we start incorporating technology. So we start to talk about wearables, for example, or apps, so menstrual tracking apps, I know we've kind of spoken about briefly. Of course, these tools can offer huge benefits in terms of scale and efficiency and things, but they also raise important questions around who owns those data and intellectual property. And this is a whole new kind of area that in research we're trying to kind of weigh up, really, is what data belongs to us as researchers, what belongs to the athlete, and what belongs to companies. And I think this is something we really need to get to grips with, to make sure that athletes feel at home with where their data is and who's in charge of their data, which ultimately should always be with the athlete.
Yeah, for sure.
And they do get confused, Sam, with that as well. When you speak to the athletes, I mean, a lot of them, in a nice possible way, don't actually care where it is, because they're not even thinking about it, but long term they may well. So I think that's something to be really mindful of, and also that they often get pulled in multiple directions, so making sure it's really clear for them the path to helping the researcher help solve their problems for them.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Liv. Kels, I'm just going to bounce a few questions back to you, if you don't mind. So I think because you come at this from multiple lenses, you have the perspective of being an athlete yourself, you also have a role in academia, and you also have your business. So you have this kind of multi-pronged perspective where you see it from all three angles, really. How, in your opinion, is data transforming the way that we support female athletes from like a physiology and nutrition perspective?
Yeah, I think that it's a big question again, and I think I'll briefly talk about some of my athletes and ways that we have used the data successfully. There's so much. So I guess in my work, I use the data as a really valuable tool and like a support system. But I know we say female athlete isn't just the menstrual cycle, but I'm going to give a really nice example of here. A lot of the time, females will come to me and they'll say, like, my menstrual cycle definitely has an impact on how I'm feeling and my performance. I need to work out the best combination for training for me. And actually, I think I shouldn't train at X time of the month because they think that's going to have an impact on their performance. And what we can quite nicely do with some of the software that I use personally with my athletes is they'll have their training on there, we can sync things like, a lot of them have like Garmin watches or Oura rings. We can sync their sleep data, their HRV data, for example. But what I also get them to do is to log their symptoms of their cycle, because it's a calendar structured software. So then what happens is I tell them, add in your symptoms, tell me how you're feeling, and let's look for patterns, because you saying it's happening once isn't an accurate reflection of what's happening in your cycle. So let's track this 3-4 months and let's see if there's any patterns there. Typically, not always, what I find is that it's very sporadic, and that really for a lot of athletes, yes, they can have some higher symptoms maybe when they're on the period, for example, but they're still able to push the same power that they could push a week ago, or the changes in maybe what they're feeling aren't linked to their cycle. It might actually just be linked to poor nutrition, poor recovery, lack of sleep, and having all of those things to kind of use and make a big support system can also help the athlete also see actually like, oh, this might not actually be a problem. Because sometimes I think the psychological impact of thinking something's going to have a effect has a bigger effect than the actual problem, if that makes sense. So it's really good and really positive. And then when we think about things like the HRV data, yes, from a Garmin, it's not the best, but it can detect trends. The Oura Ring, I believe, is slightly better. But what that can do is an athlete can eat really late at night or maybe have a drink, and they see that decline in their heart rate variability or that increase in that resting heart rate. And then as a result, they go, oh, okay, if I eat late, it actually is having an impact on my physiology, and that will have potentially an impact on my training the next day. So it's really, and things like going to sleep a little bit earlier, when they see the impact all these little factors are making, it leads to massive behaviour changes, which is ultimately going to help them improve and make the most out of the few hours they have of training per day. Well, not even hours for most because they're working, but it really allows them to have good behaviours and practices around their actual training and everything else that's going on. So I see it as like a great support system. It helps build awareness, gives us another lens to see what they're experiencing day to day. One thing I will say is the data doesn't always align with how an athlete feels. So just because their HRVs drop to the floor and the HRV is up, that doesn't mean that they feel like rubbish. Sometimes they might feel great. So it's a guidance tool, and it's part of a bigger puzzle.
Kelsey, love that. And I think, I'm scribbling notes here as well when I'm listening to you, because when I'm talking about the data and the athlete, it's really interesting when we have those conversations live as well. So the data's telling us this, but you're telling me this. How do we align it? And I'm also fascinated that Sam, you talked about the buzz around the menstrual cycle, and I think it has so many positives that people are talking about it, but equally it's got some negatives attached to it, because people are then jumping to, oh well, therefore we must make a change based on the fact that it's this time of your menstrual cycle, and that's where we have to maybe slow down a little bit and get a real thoughtful approach to it. So that we're not just making decisions for decision's sake, we're really thinking about what the information is telling us, and it's so individual. And I think that's the beauty and the challenge of women's sport.
Definitely, because people still win gold medals on their period.
Yeah,
you can't actually quantify how many people might lose gold medals, but we perform at our best at all phases of the menstrual cycle. So yeah, I think sometimes it's getting that athlete awareness that it might not be as big of an impact as they maybe think it is.
Absolutely, because the data just isn't there at the moment to support an effective menstrual cycle on a lot of these variables that we speak about. And actually a lot of the kind of hustle and bustle around it has come from influencers, right? It's on TikTok, it's on Instagram. It's not actually from hardcore, rigorously controlled scientific experiments. And that's not to negate the women that will have experience with their menstrual cycle that are consistent, where they do struggle at a particular phase. That absolutely exists. And I think it's really important that those women do feel listened to and not kind of shunned, because generally we're not seeing effects of the cycle. If a particular woman does and they say that so, then that might be something we need to consider. But yeah, the good news for the general population is that we're not seeing these effects. So we don't need to worry too much about, oh, we're in this particular phase, this is might be how I experience things, and it might not be. So yeah, really, really nice conversation there. Thank you both very much for that. Kels, in your kind of teaching side of your role, how do you start to then prepare the next generation of sports scientists to work ethically and effectively with female athlete data? What are you changing in your practice?
Oh, so good. So I do think now with how science, data, and sports science is going, that it is a responsibility of the academics now to be able to empower sports scientists to be able to make these informed decisions and be critical of data, so that we can support the future generations in female sport. I think a big part of what I try to embed personally in my teaching, both undergraduate and postgraduate, will be that kind of critical thinking and context is key kind of parameters around everything. So yes, data can be a great tool, and we've spoken about some of the ways data can inform practice or whatever that might be, but without understanding like who that data represents, how it was collected, whether it was collected well, and how it could potentially be used to have an impactful impact, it becomes very easy to misuse or even worse, misinterpret. And then we're applying incorrect contexts to the wrong people. So developing that kind of critical thinking and understanding and knowledge of when and where we need to use that data and how we can apply it is key. I think in sports science, you're often told to focus on like means and standard deviations, and P is 0.05. But when working with female athletes, we've already highlighted that, yes, some people might not be affected by the menstrual cycle, but some are. So sometimes focusing on that P value, or that, well, there was a mean change in this population of 12 people in this study, doesn't always account for what can happen at a kind of individualized basis. So we do really have to think of like those invisible numbers that maybe are masked by the 95% of the data that we're also analysing. So it's kind of encouraging students to ask those better questions. I think when we look at some of the data, and I know me and you, Sam, talk about this a lot, but what's actually going on, kind of what's the lived experience of that participant in that moment as well. So we know, for example, stress can have an impact on lots of different factors. And if they're experiencing that within the data that you're collecting as well, like there's just so many parts to it. Another thing, and there's so much I could add on here, but this one's quite important, is, are we being inclusive in who we're actually recruiting into our data sets as well? Like, yes, we want to look at menstrual cycle, but actually I think for the UK population, last time I read, about 50% of females are on contraceptives. So are we making sure that we're answering the right questions for the right populations, I guess, as well? There's all these different strands, I think, for looking at females.
It's brilliant that you're talking about how you support the next generation of sports scientists, but I work with athletes every day that almost are going back to the selfish bit. They want to know about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also our sports scientists, sports medicine, our coaches. How do we make sure that we get all of those people around the table understanding and working together to do this in the best possible way? Because, you know, I listen to a lot of the stuff you just said, and I'm like, whatever, what's the solution we're getting to?
Yeah.
So I think there's a real bit in the middle that we're still not doing well enough, that collaboration piece, that bit, like practitioners, coaches, academics, athletes, how do we get them all understanding together what's needed in order to move this forward?
Agree. And also as well, from a practitioner, research, whatever perspective, this came up at the event that we were at a few weeks ago. Like, are we actually empowering men to be able to have these conversations too? Like, we want to drive the way of females and help with the integration of athlete data, whatever it might be. But
yeah,
do men feel equipped to also have some of these conversations if they're like the direct or primary contact point for an athlete? How do we empower the sports science males as well to be able to make sure they can have conversations around the menstrual cycle, periods, energy availability if needs be, contraceptives in sport? How do we make empower them as well. And I don't think I have the answer for that, but yeah, there's so many points to it, isn't there?
For sure.
Yeah, love that, Kels, because I think you see it now at conferences where the focus might be on women and girls, and actually if you look around the room, there are just women. Where are the men in the room? And it's not that they don't want to be there, they just sometimes don't feel invited to be in that space. And we do really need to reframe that, because men are coaching women, when men are teaching women, and working with those sports at all levels, right from recreational right through to elite level. So I think you make a really, really good point there about the importance of making sure that we empower women and men to be kind of educated in this space. And I think the point I would like that you made is the context part is key. You're right, things like other factors going on in athletes' lives can be a driver of factors that are happening in the training environment or in a competition environment, outside of kind of what the coach might be doing with the athlete that day. So yeah, I think you make a really nice point there. And then just lastly, really, I wanted to hear your thoughts, so both of you, on one innovation or approach that you're particularly excited about within women's sport at the moment. And I guess I'll start by sharing what I think about this. And I think it links really nicely with something that Kelsey just built upon, actually. But I am really excited to see that we are starting to see this shift, from focusing on those kind of group averages. How do the average people respond within a sample that you might collect, to looking at that individual response in a bit more detail. So we are starting to listen a little bit more to what happens to that individual athlete and try and understand, well, why do they respond differently? So rather than just seeing them as an outlier that seems to not fit the trend, why is it that they respond differently? Do they need to have a different training stimulus? Do they respond to different foods in different ways? Do their hormones impact them in a slightly different way? And I think this move towards understanding that is crucial, and it recognizes that there's no single experience of being a female athlete and no one size fits all approach. And I think what's enabling this shift is the increasing use of technology and data. So with tools like wearables, tracking apps and digital platforms, we can now gather this individualized data over time where previously we haven't been able to. So I am with Kelsey, we're absolutely not abandoning the p-values and the means and the standard deviations, but we are getting better at valuing the individuals within a group, both from a research perspective, but I also think from a practitioner perspective as well. So Liv, what are your thoughts on kind of these next steps or things that you're excited about?
Sam, to be honest, I'm excited about this being the norm for female athletes every day. And yes, I don't know how we continue to evolve that. You know, I'm not the person to ask that question to, but I guess I still see every day that athletes find it a challenge to fit in where they have to deliver data to someone or fill something in or complete this or do that. What I'm excited about is this becomes an everyday thing as part of their everyday training and everyday life, so that the future is this is much more seamless and simple for us to get the information we need.
Oh, I don't think I can follow on both of your answers, because I feel like you both kind of hit the nail on the head there with this individuality aspect, but then also everything that you've kind of said, Liv. I think for me, like, one thing I'm excited about, and I guess this is kind of linked to Liv's, is like we are now starting to see more collaborative approaches to how we kind of do these things. And I think if we're going to make meaningful change and innovation, we have to collaborate to do that. No researcher, practitioner, scientist, whoever it might be, has all the answers for everything. So I would really have to agree with both of you, but with Liv in the context that hopefully in the future it means that female athlete is just part of something that people learn when they become a practitioner, and it's an open conversation. Still probably a while away from that, but it's the norm.
Absolutely, and that's a really nice prospect, and it's a really nice point to finish on for today. I think we've had a really nice discussion there around kind of athlete data, the importance of context, and the importance of that open dialogue between practitioners and research, and the need for that good level of communication on both sides to make sure we're really tackling the most salient issues. A huge thank you to both of our guests today, Liv Murphy and Dr. Kelsey Johnson, for providing their insights. And that's everything from today's podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough, Thanks for listening. See you next time.